It was an ordinary day in the small, peaceful neighborhood where Sarah lived with her two children. The sky was bright, the air fresh, and the world seemed calm. Sarah had just finished shopping at the local market and was walking back to her apartment with her kids in tow. Lily, her 6-year-old daughter, was chattering about the toy she'd seen in the store, while little Tom, her 4-year-old son, tugged at his mother's sleeve, his eyes wide with excitement about a new cartoon they were planning to watch once they got home. Sarah smiled as she listened to their innocent voices, her heart light with the thought of a quiet afternoon together. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so content. But as they approached their apartment building, a police car pulled up sharply beside them, its sirens cutting through the quiet like a sharp knife. The children froze, startled by the loud sound and sudden appearance of the officers. Before Sarah could even register what was happening, 2 police officers stepped out of the car, blocking the path. They didn't smile or offer any reassurance, just cold, unreadable expressions. One officer, a tall man with a stern face, moved toward her. "Sarah Thomas?" the officer asked, his voice firm. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, her heart starting to race. She didn't know why, but something about the officer's tone made her feel uneasy. She could feel her palms beginning to sweat. "We have a warrant for your arrest," the officer said, pulling out a piece of paper. He handed it to her without another word. Her mind went blank. Arrest. What had she done? She was just a mother, trying to make a life for her children. The officer continued speaking, but Sarah couldn't focus on the words. All she could hear was the sound of her own breath, shallow and quick. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Lily and Tom clung to her legs, sensing their mother's sudden fear. They looked up at her, confusion written across their small faces. "Mom," Lily asked in a small voice, "what's happening?" Sarah bent down to reassure her children, but her words failed her. She couldn't explain it. She didn't understand it herself. "It's okay, sweetie," Sarah whispered, trying to sound calm. But deep down, she felt the panic rise inside her, her thoughts racing for answers she didn't have. The officer gently grabbed Sarah's arm, signaling for her to step aside. "I'm afraid you'll need to come with us," he said. "We'll make sure your children are taken care of." Taken care of? What did that mean? Was she being taken away from her children? The thought hit her like a ton of bricks, and her body went cold. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the officers were too strong, too in control. And there was nothing she could do but comply. "Mom." "No," Tom wailed, clutching her tighter. "I want to stay with you." Lily's face crumpled, her small hands reaching out toward her mother. Sarah's heart shattered as she looked at her children. She had never felt so helpless in her life. The officers took Sarah gently but firmly, leading her toward the police car. She glanced back at her children, her heart breaking as they stood there, helpless, confused, and terrified. They didn't understand what was happening, and Sarah couldn't explain it to them. The world she knew, a world where she took care of her kids and kept them safe, was suddenly slipping away, and she had no idea why. The police car doors slammed shut, and Sarah was taken away. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, but the only thing she knew for certain was that her children were left behind, and she didn't know how long it would be before she would see them again. Sarah sat in the cold, sterile room of the police station, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't understand why she was here, why they were accusing her of something she had never done. She felt like her entire world was spinning out of control. The officers had been so serious, so determined, and their words echoed in her mind. But they hadn't told her why. Not yet. Her thoughts kept circling back to her children. Were they okay? Had they been scared? Lily and Tom didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to be pulled into something they didn't understand. All she could think about was them, how they had looked at her with wide, confused eyes when the officers took her away. Sarah's heart felt like it was being ripped apart. An officer entered the room, his footsteps heavy against the tile floor. He was a man in his late 30s, wearing a uniform that looked too stiff for him, as if he didn't quite belong in it. He didn't say anything at first, just took a seat across from Sarah. His expression was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Sarah feel like he wasn't entirely sure about what was going on either. After a long silence, the officer spoke. "We've received a report about your involvement in a crime," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no warmth in it. "A robbery at the local bank. You were allegedly seen leaving the scene." Sarah blinked, stunned. "A robbery? There must have been some mistake." "I didn't do it," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I don't know anything about a robbery. I haven't even been to the bank today." The officer didn't seem convinced. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "That's not what the evidence suggests. You need to understand, Sarah, this is serious." Her mind raced. What evidence? She couldn't think of anything that could link her to such a crime. She had been at home all morning, shopping for groceries, spending time with her children. There was no way she could have been involved in a robbery. But the officer's words made it clear. They were convinced of something. And it was her word against theirs. "I swear, I didn't do it," Sarah insisted. "I have 2 children. I've been with them all day." The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then he pulled out a file and opened it, flipping through the pages. "We have witnesses," he said, his tone still flat. "They've described you. Your vehicle was seen near the scene. Your fingerprints were found on the door. You're involved, whether you want to admit it or not." Sarah's mind went numb. How could this be happening? She didn't even have a car. She had been walking. And her fingerprints. The only thing she could think of was the store, the one where she'd been buying food. She had touched the doors, the basket, the counter. But how could they be mixing that up with something like a robbery? Her heart began to race, and her head spun. "You're making a mistake," she whispered, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense. I'm not involved in this. I don't even know anything about it." The officer's face remained impassive, but Sarah could see the tiniest flicker of doubt in his eyes. For a moment, he didn't speak, as if considering her words. But then he stood up abruptly, pushing the file toward her. "You'll have a chance to explain yourself in court," he said, his voice cold once more. "For now, you'll be held in custody until we can figure this out. But I suggest you start thinking about your story, because the longer you deny it, the worse this will look." As he left the room, the door clicked shut behind him. Sarah sat there, alone, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on her. She had no idea what to do or how to fix this. She had never been in trouble before. She didn't even know where to start. All she knew was that her children were out there, and she needed to get back to them. They needed her. But how could she fix this mess? How could she prove that she wasn't the person they thought she? The cold, dimly lit interrogation room seemed to close in on Sarah as the hours dragged on. She sat at a metal table, her fingers clasped tightly together, her mind racing. It had been hours since the officer left, and despite her best efforts to calm herself, the questions just kept swirling in her head. Why was she being accused of a robbery she knew nothing about? How could her fingerprints have been found at the scene? She couldn't understand it. She had been at home, with her kids all morning. How could they be so sure? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door swung open, and a new officer entered the room. He was older, his face weathered, with lines of experience etched around his eyes. He gave her a measured look before taking the seat across from her. This time, he didn't waste any time with small talk. He simply slid a folder toward her, opening it to reveal a set of photographs. "These are the images of the scene," he said, his voice low and steady. "Take a look. Does anything seem familiar to you?" Sarah stared at the photographs, her heart pounding as she scanned the images of the bank robbery. There were pictures of the security footage, blurry images of a person running out of the building, and another of a vehicle speeding off into the distance. She felt a tightness in her chest as she looked at the photos of the car. Her car, or what they claimed was hers. "I don't know who that is," Sarah said, pointing to the figure in the picture. "That's not me. It's not even my car. I don't own one." The officer raised an eyebrow, his expression hard to read. "Then how do you explain this?" he asked, pulling out another photo. This time, it was a close-up of the vehicle, parked near the scene. The camera had caught the license plate number clearly. "I don't know how it got there," Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "I don't even drive." The officer didn't respond right away. He flipped through a few more pages in the folder before leaning back in his chair. "The witnesses were sure about what they saw," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "They said you were there, right before the robbery happened." Sarah's mind raced. She thought back to the day before, when she had been out shopping. Had she seen anything unusual? She tried to recall every moment. Had anyone followed her? Had she been near the bank? No. She had been at the store, then gone home. It didn't make sense. How could these witnesses mistake her for someone else? The officer sighed and stood up, walking over to the small window. "I'm not saying you're guilty, Sarah," he said, his voice softer now. "But there are a lot of things pointing to you, and the evidence is stacking up." Sarah clenched her fists. She wasn't a criminal. She had done nothing wrong. But the more the officer spoke, the more she felt trapped in a story that wasn't hers. "I don't know what you want me to say," she whispered, feeling the walls close in around her. "I didn't do it. I didn't even know about the robbery until you told me." The officer turned to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We're just trying to figure this out. If you cooperate, it might help your case. But if you keep denying everything, things will only get harder." The tension in the room was thick, and Sarah could feel the pressure building with every word. She wanted to shout, to tell them they had made a mistake, but no one seemed to believe her. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming. She thought about her children again, how they must be scared and confused, waiting for her to come home. But she couldn't get to them if they kept locking her in this room, questioning her like she was a criminal. "I didn't do it," she repeated, her voice more certain now, even though doubt gnawed at the edges of her confidence. "Please, you have to believe me." The officer remained silent for a moment, studying her with a look that felt almost sympathetic. Then he nodded and left the room without another word. The door clicked shut, leaving Sarah alone again. Her heart ached with the weight of the situation. She was being torn apart, and the more she tried to explain, the more she felt like she was sinking deeper into something she couldn't control. All she could do now was wait. Wait for answers. Wait for the chance to prove she was innocent. And most of all, wait to see her children again. As Sarah sat in the small, cold interrogation room, time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, worry, and frustration. It had been days since her arrest, and she still hadn't been able to make sense of it all. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was being caught up in something bigger than herself. But what? Why had she been chosen? She wasn't a criminal. She had a family to care for, a life to protect. And yet here she was, trapped in a web of accusations that made no sense. The officers had shown her all the evidence, the photos, the fingerprints, the testimonies. It all pointed toward her, but none of it made sense. How could she have been at the scene of a robbery when she had been home with her children the whole day? She hadn't even been near the bank. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that something had gone terribly wrong. She wasn't being framed, at least, not intentionally, but something was clearly off. There had to be a mistake. As if reading her mind, the door to the interrogation room opened, and the officer from earlier stepped inside again. This time, his expression was different. He wasn't as stern as before. There was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes, a glimmer of doubt. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that they were starting to realize the truth? "Sarah," the officer began, his tone less harsh than it had been in the past. "We've been looking into this case more deeply. Some things don't add up. We found new evidence." Sarah sat up straighter, her heart racing. New evidence. Could this be it? The break she had been waiting for? Was there something that would finally clear her name? The officer continued, pulling out a stack of papers from the folder he had brought in. "We've been reviewing the security footage from the bank," he said, "and there's something we missed before. The person seen leaving the scene, it wasn't you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and confusion. "If it wasn't me, then who was it?" The officer looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "It was someone else. We couldn't see it at first, but the footage was clearer than we thought. We're still trying to figure out who they are, but it's clear now that it wasn't you. Your involvement was misunderstood." Relief flooded over Sarah in a wave, but it was quickly followed by a rising tide of frustration. How had they made such a mistake? How had they let this go on for so long, making her live in fear, uncertainty, and worry, when they could have checked the footage more carefully? "I don't understand," she said, her voice shakier now. "Why didn't you check the footage sooner? Why did you arrest me without being sure?" The officer seemed to struggle for an answer, and after a long pause, he spoke in a quieter tone. "Sometimes things get rushed. Sometimes we don't have all the answers right away. But we're trying to fix it now." Sarah felt a pang of bitterness. The idea that they had made such a crucial mistake, one that had torn her life apart, was too much to bear. But even as anger bubbled up inside her, she knew that there was still hope. If they could figure out who was truly responsible, then she might be able to clear her name and get back to her children. "I need to see them," Sarah said, her voice breaking as she thought of her kids. "My children. I haven't seen them in days. They need to know I'm coming home." The officer nodded, his face softening slightly. "We're working on that. We'll get them back to you, Sarah. I promise." With that, he stood up, gathering his papers, and left the room. Sarah was left alone again, but this time, she felt something different. There was hope. It wasn't over yet, and she wasn't giving up. She would fight until the truth came out, no matter what. She would do whatever it took to get back to her children and make sure they were safe. Nothing else mattered. Sarah's mind couldn't stop racing. Even though the officer's words gave her a small sense of hope, the pain of being away from her children was overwhelming. It had been days since she'd last seen Lily and Tom, and every moment felt like an eternity. She thought about them constantly, how scared they must have been, how confused they must have felt when she was suddenly taken away. Her heart ached to think of them alone, without her to comfort them, to tell them everything would be okay. Her thoughts drifted back to that morning when everything seemed so normal. It had been a simple day. Shopping, playing with the kids, making lunch together. Now, everything had changed. The life she had known was ripped away in an instant, and she was left fighting to get back to the people she loved most in the world. A few hours later, a social worker came to speak with Sarah. The woman was kind, but there was an air of professionalism about her that made Sarah's stomach tighten. She was told that Lily and Tom were being taken care of in a temporary foster home, and that they were safe. The social worker tried to reassure Sarah, but the words felt hollow. Being told they were safe didn't make Sarah feel better. It only reminded her of how far away they were. "I just need to see them," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Please, I need to make sure they're all right." The social worker hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. But the situation is complicated. You've been arrested, and until things are settled, they can't be with you." The words hit Sarah like a punch in the stomach. She understood the reasoning behind it, but the thought of her children in a strange place, away from her, was unbearable. They didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to be caught up in a situation they couldn't understand. She was supposed to protect them, to keep them safe, not to be locked away, fighting for her freedom. As the social worker left the room, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts again. The small window in the interrogation room offered no comfort, just the view of the empty parking lot outside. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, the soft buzz of fluorescent lights above her, but everything felt so far away. Her thoughts were consumed by Lily and Tom. Were they scared? Had they asked about her? Did they wonder when she would be coming home? A wave of guilt washed over Sarah. She should have been there for them. She should have been the one to reassure them, to tell them it would all be okay. Instead, she had been torn away, leaving them behind in a world they didn't understand. Suddenly, the door opened again, and this time it was a familiar face. It was the detective, the one who had seemed so uncertain about the case. He stepped into the room with a look of determination, and for the first time, Sarah felt like there was someone who actually believed her. "We found something," the detective said, his voice low and urgent. "We've been going through the records, and there's a connection we missed before." Sarah sat up straight, her heart leaping in her chest. "What do you mean? Is it something about the robbery?" The detective nodded, his eyes narrowing with focus. "Yes, we found a lead. Someone else might be involved in this. Someone who may have been using your name." Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. "What do you mean, using my name?" "There's a pattern," the detective explained. "Your identity was used to cover up this robbery. Someone may have been pretending to be you, using your personal information to throw us off the trail." Sarah's mind raced. Could this be the break she had been waiting for? Someone had framed her, and now the truth was starting to come to light. She clung to that hope with everything she had. "Do you think you can find out who did this?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency. The detective gave her a nod. "We're working on it, but it's going to take some time. We're going to track down the real person behind this, and once we do, we'll be able to clear your name." Sarah exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the situation lift just a little. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in days, she felt like there was a way forward. There was still hope. She wasn't going to give up. She was going to fight for her children, for her life, and for the truth. Nothing else mattered. Sarah spent the following days in a haze of worry, but also a small, growing sense of hope. The detective's words, about someone else using her identity, kept echoing in her mind. Could it really be true? Could she be the victim of such a cruel setup? She couldn't stop thinking about it. It seemed unbelievable, but as the days passed, new information came to light that made it harder to deny. There was a chance, just a small one, that she could clear her name and get back to her children. The tension in the police station was palpable, with officers and detectives working overtime to follow up on leads. Sarah had heard fragments of conversations as she sat in the sterile waiting room, waiting for updates. She heard them mention the possibility of tracking down a suspect, someone who had been using stolen identities for crimes. It was a long shot, but it was something. It was hope. Still, the waiting felt endless. She longed to hear more, to feel like something was being done. But the more time passed, the more anxious she became. Every minute that went by felt like a minute stolen from her children. She wondered where they were, what they were doing. Were they still scared? Had they eaten? Did they miss her? She tried to push the thoughts away, but it was impossible. The thought of her kids without her made her stomach churn. It hurt in a way she couldn't explain. One day, a new officer came into the room where Sarah was waiting. He was younger, with a fresh-faced determination in his eyes. He didn't say much at first, but sat down beside her and placed a few files on the table. "We've been working through the evidence," he said, his voice steady, but with a sense of urgency. "There's something important we need to discuss." Sarah leaned forward, her heart racing. "What is it? Is it about my children? About the case?" The officer nodded. "We found something. It's not just about the bank robbery. We've discovered there are connections to other crimes, other cases where similar methods were used. Someone's been trying to cover their tracks by framing people like you." Sarah's mind spun. "What does that mean? Who would do that to me?" The officer continued, flipping through the files. "There are records showing that this person, whoever they are, has been using various stolen identities. Your name is just one of many they've taken. They used it to divert suspicion. We believe they may have been in the area when the robbery occurred, but we don't have solid proof yet. The idea of someone using her identity felt like a nightmare. The thought that someone was out there, committing crimes while using her name, was a terrifying realization. But it was also the key to clearing her name. The officer's words gave her new strength. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about stopping the person who had done this to her, who had made her a scapegoat in their crime. "We're doing everything we can to track this person down," the officer reassured her. "We're looking at all their past activities, trying to figure out their next move." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in days. The detective had promised to find the real culprit, and now it seemed like they were getting closer. Still, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that it was all moving too slowly. She couldn't afford to wait much longer. Every minute spent in that cold room, away from her children, made her more determined to get out of there and prove her innocence. "I just need to get back to my kids," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please. They need me." The officer's expression softened for a moment. "We're working on it. As soon as we have enough to clear your name, you'll be free to go. And we'll make sure your children are returned to you." Sarah's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She wasn't there yet, but at least there was a way forward. There was a light at the end of the tunnel, no matter how faint it seemed. All she had to do now was hold on. Hold on until the truth finally came to light. Days passed in a blur for Sarah. Each one felt longer than the last, as she sat in the cold, sterile room, waiting for the breakthrough that would clear her name. The uncertainty was suffocating. There were still so many questions with no answers. Who was behind the crimes that had been committed using her identity? And why had she been the one targeted? The only thing that kept her going was the thought of her children. The thought of being reunited with them, of holding them in her arms again, was the one thing that brought her any peace. Lily and Tom had been placed in foster care, and Sarah couldn't help but worry about how they were coping. Had they been frightened? Had they wondered when their mom would come for them? But there was finally progress. The detective had said they were getting closer to finding the person responsible. The new lead that had surfaced, that someone had been using stolen identities, had opened a whole new door of possibilities. It wasn't just about the robbery anymore. It was about uncovering a criminal who had been causing harm to multiple innocent people, and Sarah had become one of their victims. One morning, as Sarah sat in the waiting area, the door opened, and the detective she had come to trust stepped inside. He looked more determined than ever, his eyes focused as he approached her. This time, Sarah didn't wait for him to speak. She stood up quickly, her pulse quickening. "Have you found the person who did this?" she asked, her voice a mixture of hope and desperation. The detective nodded, his face serious but reassuring. "Yes, we've tracked them down. We've got a lead on the person who's been using your identity to commit crimes." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The detective went on to explain the details, his words quick and precise. "We've found evidence linking the suspect to a series of thefts, and they've been using stolen identities to cover their tracks. You were just one of many victims. We believe we know who they are, and we're closing in on them now." The relief that washed over Sarah was overwhelming, but it didn't last long. The detective's next words made her stomach drop. "We still need to confirm some details before we can make an arrest, but we're confident we're on the right track." Sarah's mind was racing. They were so close now, but she couldn't afford to waste any more time. Her children were still in foster care, and every second felt like a lifetime. She needed to be with them. They needed to know she was coming for them. "I can't wait any longer," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, can you get them back to me? I need to see my children." The detective hesitated for a moment before responding. "We're doing everything we can to reunite you with your kids. Once we confirm this lead and wrap up the case, you'll be free to go, and they'll be returned to you." Sarah nodded, her heart filled with both hope and anxiety. She couldn't stay in that room forever. She couldn't keep waiting. But there was a part of her that knew it wasn't over yet, that they still needed to make sure everything was settled. She couldn't afford to let her guard down now. The detective turned to leave, but before he did, he gave Sarah a reassuring look. "We're close, Sarah. I promise you, we're almost there." As he walked out the door, Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The detective's words had given her a new sense of purpose. They were so close to the truth, and once it all came to light, she would finally be able to go home, to be with her children again, and put this nightmare behind her. The next few days would be crucial. The case was moving forward, but it still wasn't over. Sarah clung to the hope that everything would be resolved soon, and she would finally be free. The thought of holding Lily and Tom in her arms again kept her going, and no matter what happened, she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The days seemed to drag on, but Sarah knew that the end was near. The detective's words had filled her with both hope and anticipation, and she could feel the weight of the last few weeks slowly lifting from her shoulders. She had been through so much, but now, finally, it looked like the truth was coming to light. She clung to that truth with everything she had, knowing that once it was uncovered, she would be able to return to her children, and everything would go back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after all this had happened. Her thoughts always returned to her children, Lily and Tom. They had been through so much, and she hadn't been there for them the way a mother should. They had been scared and confused, placed in foster care without understanding why their mother wasn't there to protect them. The thought of them waiting for her, hoping she would return, tore at her heart. She needed to hold them again, to reassure them that everything was going to be okay. But for now, she had to wait. One morning, as she sat in the small room where she had spent most of her time, the door opened. The detective stepped inside, his expression serious but determined. Sarah stood up quickly, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't keep the hope from rising again. This could be it. This could be the moment she had been waiting for. "I have good news," the detective said, his voice calm but with an air of finality. "We've got the person responsible." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she blinked in disbelief. "You found them?" The detective nodded. "Yes, we've confirmed everything. We've arrested the person who's been using your name, and we're charging them with several crimes. The evidence is clear. They tried to frame you, and now we have the proof." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a rush of emotion. She had been so afraid that she would never get out of this situation, that she would never be able to clear her name. But now it was finally happening. It was over. "Is everything really finished?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and relief. "It is," the detective said, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're free to go. We'll be contacting your children's foster home, and once everything is settled, they'll be returned to you." Sarah's heart soared. She could hardly believe it. She was going to see her children again. They would be safe. She would be able to wrap her arms around them, tell them she loved them, and make sure they knew everything was going to be okay. After all the pain, the worry, and the fear, she was finally going home. As the detective left the room to make the necessary arrangements, Sarah sank into the chair, her emotions overwhelming her. It felt like a dream, but it was real. She was free. She had won. The truth had come to light, and the person who had framed her was finally being held accountable for their actions. Her heart raced as she thought of her children. Soon, she would see them again. She couldn't wait to hold them, to tell them that their mother was back, that they were going to be okay. The next chapter of her life was waiting, and this time, she was going to make sure that nothing at all, could take her away from them again. The door opened again, and the detective returned with a few final papers. He handed them to Sarah, who signed them quickly, eager to move forward. "You're all set," he said with a smile. "Your children are going to be so happy to see you." Sarah stood up, feeling lighter than she had in days. She finally understood the true meaning of freedom. It wasn't just about being able to walk out of that room. It was about the promise of being reunited with the people who mattered most. As she walked out of the station, the weight of the last few weeks lifted completely. She could see the light at the end of the tunnel, and as the detective drove her to the foster home, where her children were waiting, Sarah smiled through her tears, knowing that everything was finally going to be okay.